Okay.
Well, nothing could equal that. I killed and drew the noble fish, then kept it in a side run covered with sycamore fronds. I rested the pool a while, tasting the air, sitting and drying off, smiling to myself. Then I fished until I caught a second one, a different highly colored trout with brick red belly and creamy fin borders, that jumped only twice and bulled about before giving up. Its body was shorter and thicker. I drew it too, draped my two prizes in more wet leafage, and climbed the draw, damp, hungry, and utterly at peace. Back at the farmhouse, Mrs. Black weighed the fish for me on kitchen scales. Each was almost exactly 3 pounds. Then my hostess did the honors with butter and lemon on the rainbow, and we had our small feast. And then we three were murmuring together on the porch in a quiet dusk matching the whole rare quality of the day, a clear gradual evening of fireflies and bird calls, with a few bats and nighthawks diving and maneuvering above the yard in the still warm gravel road. I thought first to ask about the saddest, Vickers. In place of my teenage disgust, I now wanted to know if he'd changed his ways. Lilybeth, in the ladder-back chair nearest to mine, answered, "Zach? Oh, he's been dead a long time, Jay. He broke his neck out drinking and driving not long after you left, not even a year. He and his buddy went off the road close to Norfolk. You know, that narrow place where the road swoops down to the bridge? His buddy just had cuts and bruises." Surprise, but not so much either. Zach had been working at it all the time, maybe best for all concerned. I took a moment to absorb it. A whippoorwill, the summer evening voice of this country for me, opened up in the pasture across the road. I asked about his family, the wife and the 2 little boys. "Oh, they're fine. As far as I know, she sort of blossomed out, moved them over to Ash Flat. I think she remarried." "What about Jack and his family?" "Jack got married pretty quick. Maybe you remember that quiet blonde girl with freckles, the one that rode with us in the school truck? He settled them near his folks at Calico Rock. They have a bunch of kids. I don't know about his sisters." "Say, what about Harold? What's he doing now?" Silence. I glanced toward them in the gloom, sensing their faces turned toward me. "Oh, Jay, Harold was killed in the war right at the first." "Oh, how? What?" "Oh, everyone here was... We just thought the world of Harold." She paused. "Yes, he volunteered the first thing, said he felt his country needed him, went through basic and came home looking like a million. Then he shipped out for Far East, and in no time at all, maybe a month. His body was back at Norfolk Station in an army casket. This whole part of the county came to the funeral. Even some of the tough old men were crying, weren't they, Mom?" A chair shifted, and Mrs. Black cleared her throat. "Oh, yes, we all were. And of course his mother, we felt so bad for her, a widow, and left with no one at all then." The whole evening changed, as though a curtain dropped. The space chant of the whippoorwill meant something weary and ancient now, nothing like the musical blessing before. Lilybeth added details, then went on to talk of others I'd known. And I made responses, but all the time a fragment of conscience in me stayed frowning over this single blunt fact. It measured Harold's instant volunteering against my skeptical view of society, all my stratagems to avoid killing or being killed, my deferments, defense plant work, and finally getting assigned stateside by helping my training company cheat, and then my 2 years as a model soldier clerk because of my extreme dislike of the whole dehumanizing system. Harold always responded first to any assumed social need, just part of his glad approach to living. Lilybeth said he hadn't changed a bit after we left. You could always count on Harold. We turned in early, but for a long while I lay propped against the headboard in Bob's old room, something like a knot swelling inside. The night sound sifted out through the window screen like faint pin pricks. At some point my puzzle resolved itself enough that I dropped into sleep. Country folk rise early in hot weather. I found the 2 women already in the high-ceiling kitchen. While the earth was still gray and cool, we took a light breakfast of toast and coffee. "No fishing today," I told them. I'd wander around until time to start back. No food, thanks. Don't expect me until you see me. No, I'll be fine." Again, I set off down the gravel highway through Salesville's scattering of buildings, past the low modern replacement for the old white steeple grade school. Once more I climbed the wooden pasture gate, dropped over and walked toward the rising sun. Moving, I felt tight, focused, tingling all over. I sensed where I needed to go. My body took over, moving faster in long strides. I turned down the steep shaded draw again, leaping back and forth, totally aware of all I flashed past, freeze-framing all like a camera. I hit bottom, broke through the brush on the railway dike, turned downstream and ran even faster, bursting with fantastic energy. By the time I was opposite the island tip, the round barn, the cornfield, I was pure sound and motion, flat out, arms waving, chest heaving, screaming my rage, my burning throat. I ran straight into the mist and roar of the river bend, staggering as the water force tore at my legs, stumbled and clawed my way to a smooth limestone hump in mid-river, scrambled up and wrapped arms around my head. Then everything broke loose. In the throes of giving way, everything blots out in a timeless, fiery continuum of pain, until without volition it fades to allow other senses to come haltingly back. Mouth tastes sickly, a hint of snuffling childhood. Body comes aware of mist on skin, wet and chill. Sound intrudes like waking up, the pounding roar of rapids. Light was at first a glowing cloud of gold, green, blue, gray, the glint of sun in eyelashes and on water, foam, rock. Then the mottled surface of fossil print limestone, sloping into force lines of current. And last, centered in the midst, one tiny bright eye focused on mine. A shock ran through me. I blinked and squinted. A hatchling turtle, no larger than the ball of my thumb, clung to the slope by a single claw. The neck was outstretched, the head up an angle, warily regarding me. A pulse throbbed in its slender striped throat. I noted its newness, freshness, perfection of shell and diminutive limb. And again, the patterned neck and the shining eye let out a croaky laugh and said, "Well, hello. How'd you survive in all this?" The tiny animal released its hold in a swimming turn and was whisked away. At least it could function among immense forces. I must have stayed a very long time, wet arms around wet knees, basking in sunlit mist, gazing into water rush, cushioned by its music. At last, even my fit body told me I couldn't stay there forever. Like a creaky old man, I slid cautiously off the rounded hump, slipping and stumbling out. And in the same shambling mode, I walked the roundabout way to my friend's home, plodding beside the overgrown railway berm as far as the untended tablet grave. Without even looking that way or even raising my head to glimpse the gray concrete wall blocking the valley, I padded up the dusty road to Salesville. I glanced once toward the vine-smothered slopes of Ellis, but passing our old home place, I stared steadily ahead. At the farmhouse, Lilybeth had her belongings together and said a restrained but tender goodbye to her husband. I was struck by how sobered she acted now, not a vestige left of the daring tomboy of our school days. Driving back through a calm purple dusk, we spoke very little. But I did mention that I seriously proposed to write some form of memorial to Harold. After a moment, Lilybeth said earnestly, "Well, if you do, Jay, I certainly want to read it." The essay, Harold's Memorial. I never honored that promise. Every attempt made at about 5-year intervals either collapsed in maudlin sentiment or failed to reflect Harold's true impact. So at last I gave it up, defeated in honoring my pledge. The years slipped by until I awoke in my 70s, when Annie's loving query forced me to examine my life and to fix on that formative year on my post-war return. And then I realized that my pledge and the answer to Annie's question were the same, that whatever I am, the better part owes much to Harold's living example. I don't claim that my explosive reaction to news of his death came solely from that one shock. Most likely, I'd moved toward such an outburst for years. Since that week when I faced Vida's mental breakdown and bent over my dying dog, nothing else had shaken me loose that way, although my failed love affair came closest. When I left military service, I felt stripped of all hopeful illusions. But I clearly was wrong. Maybe my rage and sorrow were some negative coming of age, a rejection of a culture that worships dominance and manipulation. None of this lessens the early reality of Harold's effect in that crucial formative time. My rush to that hump of river rock was a prelude to a massive, cumulative storm, a denial of things as they are. It's fair to give a brief overview of my own later life pattern. I remained somewhat alienated and only partly socialized, a task that my spouse accomplished. I married late at 30 into a ready-made family, still unsure that I could live with anyone. I am still happily in their midst a half-century later. My wife and I shared many joys and values, had a warm family and home life, and taught together in colleges until retirement to this Ozark Valley and the joys of pseudo-pioneering. However, in the 1990s, she began to slip into dementia, her lively and venturesome self draining slowly away, never completely though. She remains a joy to the nursing home staff. I'll touch briefly on TM's and Zach's lives before resuming with Harold's. TM, coming from an earlier generation, enjoyed a long, eventful, varied, and physically active life. His passion for the outdoors and nature was perhaps his greatest gift to me, going far beyond mere killing and catching. For most of his span, he had health and strength and took pride in his work skills. Zach, in contrast, seems, from what he missed and from the damage he did, the saddest case. Through either alcoholism, a perverse, destructive joy, or ignorance, he damaged family and risked his being until he was blotted out. Alcoholism alone would suffice. I never heard of early causes that may have helped turn him into a demonic clown. He remains a question mark to me, since I loathed him in my teenage years and cared little enough on hearing of his death. I feel different about him now. Over the years, I've known men, still young friends and acquaintances, who either actually killed themselves or risked themselves until they reached a questionable death. I felt that 4 were persons who held great promise for themselves and for society. 2 clearly jeopardized themselves, no substance abuse involved. Another drowned himself after failing grades in medical school. Yet another hanged himself after passing all barriers in graduate school. I admired and grieved for all of them. This high incidence of masculine violence and suicide in our culture deeply troubles me. Zach's case pointed up a sad pattern beginning that has since spread widely. It's now too common, even in rural areas where it was once rare. The backwoods drug epidemic makes it worse. Harold's brief life utterly differed. In all my working life, laboring, defense plant work, the Army, college teaching, I've never known anyone else of Harold's remarkable, vibrant nature. Knowing him only perhaps 14 months, I'm still puzzled by why he impressed me so powerfully, especially in interaction with everyone around him. I never knew of any instance of his causing pain or distress. Apparently all social contact was benign until the day he left the community to go to war. Others were just as mystified. All attempts to describe him floundered in banalities. Just a wonderful person. Everybody loved him. To know him was to feel richer and more vital. I believe persons responded instinctively as plants do to light. Truthfully, I'd seldom thought specifically of Harold. In the years away from Baxter County, had plunged into the hunt for love and meaning common to us all. Yet the news of his death struck me so powerfully with a sense of desolation and loss. I more than once regretted not seeking out his mother for answers, but even then suspected I'd get no final answers. We are all part of this mystery we inhabit but hardly understand. In my opinion, his impact could not have come from mere charisma. I've never trusted charismatic types. I dislike even the idea of allowing anyone to substitute his values for my own experience and judgment. I found the burst of guru worship in the decade of the 60s pitiful. If Harold led, he led by example, a pattern of radiant potential. Given the chance, outside his limited circle, Harold might have moved far. For me, his death in war represents an established national policy of dedicating and training a large proportion of our youth for military forces. His death, with that of several others from Baxter County, deeply affected the locals, wounding kin and friends in ways no amount of citations, medals, and death payments can ever heal. One teenager, 17, received a posthumous Medal of Honor. Most are posthumous. 4 of the 6 from this state were posthumous. The 2 survivors were commissioned officers. My greatest reward in years of college teaching came not from professional status and perks, and certainly not in the modest salary, but from contact with an exceptional fraction of students, at most 6%, the creative and still open-minded young. In fairness, I should include a few sleepers, like the young man who spotted me and rushed up as I made a rest stop, shouting my name and claiming that I'd changed his life. That select group sustained my faith in the calling. Harold's life attitude gave me that same trust in the life process, a sense of moving together towards some great unstated goal. At some stage, anyone working wholeheartedly at learning and creating will experience that same supreme joy. So Harold's case and the fate of all of our young today, what does it mean? Both individually and for the future of the species. What's my perspective as I near my 8th decade? In the overwhelming confusion of our world society with its tacit acceptance of mass warfare and genocide, what significance does the death in war of one young human have? An armchair chauvinist might claim such a death as an ideal fate for a youthful patriot, much as one citizen boasted of his son's death, wishing he had 10 sons to die in battle. A cynic may shrug and point out that young recruits and replacements commonly die first in combat, that it means little beyond the brutal fact that bravery is nothing without mental toughness and keen observation, and that aside from bad karma, the fated bullet, Harold was likely killed by his own naivete. Or that Harold took his chance by wanting to leave home and see the world. The less educated and those from rural and mountainous areas contribute quite heavily to military service. Of the nation's 33,667 combat deaths, 3,249 non-combat, 103,000 wounded in Korea. Our low population state lost 461 killed. No figures on Arkansas wounded. About Harold's naivete, I might agree. Maybe he felt, as many young do, that some aura of invincibility shielded him. I assume also that he trusted his nation's leaders not to lightly thrust him into a distant, non-defensive war. On an Asian peninsula, this war, begun first and hurriedly authorized over a weekend by the Truman administration, Truman's War, a police action, was nominally under a United Nations mandate, but actually in both military numbers and strategy a U.S. action, as with the Persian Gulf and Iraq wars later. I feel it was pursued not through feelings of brotherhood with South Koreans, as from fears that they'd become pawns of communism in a global power game, the old domino theory, and by the desire, so soon after World War II, to keep the Pacific an American lake. Most of those I trained with in the early 1950s were a few years younger, with no more than a high school degree, and with little concept of political theories, despite possibly enduring a required civics course. As for any idea of a higher patriotism, I doubt that theirs went beyond the popular myths and flag worship. And I was quite ignorant of the history of war resistors and peace activists. By the time of my first permanent party assignment, I'd heard of a few conscientious objectors and even of a few turncoat prisoners in North Korea. Just before my separation from active duty, I saluted a full colonel guarded by an MP taking the air near my unit. As a prisoner, he had broadcast for the North Koreans, was exchanged at Panmunjom, and was awaiting his court-martial. A small, neat man, he looked very much like William Faulkner. One way or another, war or military buildup has affected my family since I, at age 4, gazed up admiringly at great-great-grandfather Alonzo's oval photo portrait, jaunty in his cavalry trooper uniform and forage cap, saber by his side. He served on the Kansas border in the Civil War and was very proud of that service, though I never heard of any real action. At age 8, I lay face down on a farmhouse porch in South Mississippi listening to the noon newscast tell of the German army's advance through Poland. We were in the Hattiesburg area for TM to work on Camp Shelby as part of the U.S. defense build-up for World War II. It's an ill wind that doesn't blow somebody somewhere some good. I've read that by 1940 the U.S. still had 8 million, mostly men, unemployed. I've also read that the pre-war industry can't be credited solely with ending the Great Depression. After Camp Shelby, we moved on to Mobile, where TM and his partner employed 40 men in 2 shifts a day to paint and camouflage hangars and buildings at Brookley Field. There in my 5th grade classroom, I heard FDR on the radio announce that a state of war existed between the Axis powers and the U.S. Dad was not drafted in World War II, but classified 3C due to his 5 dependents and to a severe electrical injury to his leg at age 17. One of his younger brothers did serve and suffered a concussion when flung from a careering Jeep in Belgium. Chronic head pain blighted his later years. In the Korean conflict, my wife's cousin Bill Moore was killed in the push down the peninsula by Chinese and North Korean forces. Bill, an AP correspondent, went to observe the retreat and took cover under a bridge with 3 other reporters when fired upon. The story told by the survivors is that as the firing increased, they decided to run for it, but Bill turned back to help when the last one called out he was hit. The others kept running and escaped. In the confusion of retreat, no bodies were recovered. Bill was an exceptional person whom all mourned for years. We have only a photo of a wall plaque in Washington with his name and those of other deceased reporters. Months later, one of Bill's colleagues checked into a Tokyo hotel and found Bill's suits hanging in a closet. Entering the Army during the Korean War period changed my attitudes in a hurry. Older than most of my fellow inductees, I still held the same illusions as the general public about military service, that all of our boys, euphemism, were noble young men doing an admirable job, euphemism, to defend our society's principles, and that whatever else the training process would, quote, make a man of the recruit. But even the induction center turned me around. Any appeal to one's basic humanity and sense of dedication vanished, replaced with cannon fodder, quote, quote, when I heard a jaunty non-com say after a rapid and expressionless reading of the Oath of Allegiance, okay, anyone who disagrees with this, take one step back. No one did, of course. All right, he bellowed, your soul may belong to God, but your ass belongs to Uncle Sam. Growing up, I tolerated the foul language, denigration of women, and butt-slapping camaraderie of high school and college boys, but Army culture went beyond that. In practice, the policy aimed at stripping away any idea of self-worth, imposing instead some warrior ethic of instant obedience and loyalty to one's superiors, as well as a degree of contempt for civilian culture. Personnel not enthusiastic about this gung-ho attitude were scorned by the regular Army tough guys, who referred to the medical corps enlisted men as ball-bearing wax. Adding to this mindset, the physical demands and emotional conditioning of training cycles was meant to transform the recruit into a killing machine. It may have done that for some. I instinctively resisted it. I went through 16 weeks of infantry and engineer training, 6 more of clerk school, but the general tone of badgering and verbal sadism, coercion laced with profanity and obscenity stayed the same. The atmosphere of being herded and driven instead of being led was consistent. Yeah, I see it. Becoming permanent party at the end of training was better. I now had a little rank, a certain status, and freedom to inflict minor verbal abuse on inferiors while kowtowing to superiors. I confess that I succumbed to the lure of verbal sadism a bit. Wars may be fought, but even in actual combat, a second struggle goes on between bad leaders and the ill-led. After the training cycles, I had 5 commanding officers. 2 were clearly unsure and incompetent. 1 both incompetent and addicted to drugs and alcohol. 1 an alcoholic sadist. And the last was definitely the only officer and gentleman of the group. A black National Guard captain, he faced 2 of the Army's many prejudices. There was a quota on the number of blacks in each unit, and the NG on 1 service number meant no good. Sick of the service and suffering a flu virus, I surprised myself by staying 2 days beyond separation to post some unit fund records. The CO was also due for separation soon and feared that any petty discrepancy might be used against him. He knew that I was being released, but came to me and asked that favor directly. In other words, he recognized my basic humanity as his own decent behavior to the troops had forced me to recognize his. Summing up, I'd say I served in a necessarily undemocratic system, observing a waste of both human potential and materiel, plus some deliberate criminal action in my first permanent party unit. I was often at the mercy of martinet and sadistic types. As an administrative sergeant, I knew of a few instances of torment and injustice, usually based on ethnic or religious prejudice, which I was